The tear-stained letter trembled in Hannah O'Brien's hands as she stood in the dusty street of Silverline, Wyoming Territory, 1878, with her tiny son wailing in the crook of her arm. The news of her husband's death had arrived just 2 weeks after she'd given birth, leaving her stranded in this frontier town with nothing but grief and a newborn to show for her 22 years of life. Good Lord, woman, can't you shut that child up? A heavy-set woman with pinched lips scowled as she passed Hannah on the boardwalk. Some of us have business to attend to without all that racket. Hannah tried to soothe the baby, bouncing him gently as tears streamed down her own face. She had named him Michael after her grandfather, hoping to give him strength, but now she wondered if she had enough strength for both of them. Crying won't bring your man back, muttered another passerby, a gray-haired gentleman who didn't even bother to stop. Best pull yourself together before you and that baby end up in the poorhouse. Hannah felt a fresh wave of tears threatening to spill over. She had traveled west with her husband Thomas from Boston just 6 months ago, full of dreams for their future. He'd taken work at the silver mine while she prepared for their child's arrival. Now Thomas was gone, buried in a hastily dug grave after a mine collapse, and the company had already rented their small cabin to another family. She had 3 days left at the boarding house before her money ran out completely. I swear, some women just ain't cut out for frontier life, said a woman loudly to her companion, weeping like a willow over every little hardship. Little hardship, Hannah whispered, but no one was listening. Michael's cries grew louder, his tiny face red with effort. Hannah knew he was hungry, but she needed to find somewhere private to feed him. The stares of judgment weighed on her shoulders as heavily as her grief. Move along, woman. You're blocking the way to the mercantile, barked a man in a business suit, nearly pushing past her. Hannah stepped back, stumbling slightly, when a deep voice cut through the murmurs of disapproval. That's enough. The words weren't shouted, but they carried an authority that silenced the street instantly. Hannah turned to see a tall man dismounting from a chestnut stallion. His face was partially shaded by a wide-brimmed hat, but she could see the firm set of his jaw beneath several days' growth of beard. His duster was covered in trail dust, and the spurs on his boots jingled softly as he approached. "These good folks bothering you, madam?" he asked, his blue eyes meeting Hannah's tear-filled ones. Before she could answer, the businessman who had tried to push past her spoke up. "This woman and her squalling brat have been disrupting the peace all morning. Some of us have work to do." The tall stranger turned slowly to face the man, his hand resting casually near the holster on his hip. "That's my family she holds," he said quietly, the lie so unexpected that Hannah almost gasped. "And I'd take it kindly if you'd show a little respect." The businessman blanched, taking a step back. "I didn't realize." "No, you didn't," the stranger cut him off. "Now I suggest you and everyone else go about your business and leave my wife and son be." Hannah stared at the man in bewilderment as the small crowd that had gathered dispersed quickly, muttering apologies or simply averting their eyes. The stranger tipped his hat to her. "Blake Vance, madam." "Looks like you could use a friend." Hannah clutched her baby closer. "Why would you lie for me? You don't even know me." Blake Vance's weathered face softened slightly, because no woman should have to stand alone in the street being mocked while she grieves. And no baby should have folks complaining about his crying when he's just doing what comes natural. He gestured toward the baby. "May I?" Hesitantly, Hannah shifted Michael so Blake could see his tiny face. The baby had quieted somewhat, perhaps startled by the new deep voice nearby. "Fine-looking boy," Blake said with a nod. "Got his mama's eyes." Hannah felt a fresh tear slide down her cheek. His father never even saw him. Blake looked around the street, noting the curious glances still being cast their way. "This isn't the place for this conversation." "Have you eaten today?" Hannah shook her head, realizing she hadn't had anything since the previous evening. "There's a cafe down the street that serves decent food. Let me buy you a meal while you tell me your story." He must have noticed her hesitation because he added, "I promise I'm just offering help, madam, no strings attached." Hannah considered her options, which were pitifully few. "Why would you help a complete stranger?" Blake's gaze drifted to the horizon for a moment. "Because 6 years ago, someone helped me when I needed it most. Sometimes that's all it takes to keep going. He offered his arm. Shall we? Hannah took a deep breath and nodded, shifting Michael to her other arm and tentatively placing her hand on Blake's offered elbow. As they walked toward the cafe, she realized this was the first genuinely kind gesture she'd experienced since receiving news of Thomas's death. The cafe was small but clean, with checkered curtains and the smell of fresh bread. Blake guided Hannah to a corner table, away from the windows and curious eyes. He pulled out her chair before taking his own seat across from her. A plump waitress approached, her eyebrows rising at the sight of Hannah's tear-streaked face and the baby in her arms. "Well, if it isn't Blake Vance back in town," she said with a warm smile, "and with a family no less." Blake returned the smile easily. "Hello, Dorothy, just helping out the lady here. She's had a rough morning." Dorothy's face softened as she looked at Hannah and the baby. Poor thing. "What can I get for you too?" "Whatever's hot and filling," Blake answered. "And some tea for the lady." When Dorothy left to fetch their order, Hannah adjusted Michael in her arms. He had fallen into an exhausted sleep after his long bout of crying. "You're known here," Hannah observed quietly. Blake nodded. "I stop through Silverline every few months. I run cattle from Texas up to Wyoming and Montana. Been doing it for about 8 years now." "You're a cowboy," Hannah said, not quite a question. "Trail boss these days. My men are camped outside of town with the herd. We delivered most of them to the Henderson Ranch yesterday, but we're resting up before heading back south." Hannah studied his face, noting the lines around his eyes that spoke of years squinting into the sun and the calluses on his hands as he removed his hat and placed it on the table. He was older than her, perhaps 30, with dark hair that curled slightly where it met his collar. "I'm Hannah O'Brien," she finally offered, "and this is Michael." "Pleased to meet you properly, Mrs. O'Brien," Blake said with a slight nod. "It's Miss now, I suppose," Hannah said, her voice catching. "My husband Thomas died 2 weeks ago, a collapse at the silver mine." Blake's expression darkened. "I'm sorry to hear that. Those mines are death traps, too many good men lost." Dorothy returned with a pot of tea, a plate of beef stew for Blake, and a bowl of chicken soup for Hannah. She also brought a basket of freshly baked bread. "You eat now, honey," she told Hannah. "Nothing seems as bad on a full stomach." When they were alone again, Hannah carefully shifted Michael to one arm and picked up her spoon with the other. The first taste of the warm soup nearly made her cry again. She hadn't realized how hungry she truly was. Blake buttered a piece of bread and placed it on her plate. "Start with that." "The soup's hot." Hannah nodded gratefully. "Why did you tell those people I was your family?" Blake took a bite of his stew before answering. "People respect what they understand. A widow crying alone is something they can ignore or mock. A man's wife needs to be treated with respect." He shrugged. "It was the quickest way to get them to leave you be." "Thank you," Hannah said quietly. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along. It's been difficult." "What are your plans now?" Blake asked. Hannah stared into her soup. "I don't have any. The mining company gave me 3 days to vacate our cabin after Thomas died. They needed it for another worker. I've been staying at Mrs. Perkins' boarding house, but my money runs out day after tomorrow." She stroked Michael's downy head. "I don't know what to do. I have no family out here, and it would take every penny I have just to buy a ticket halfway back to Boston." Blake considered her situation thoughtfully. "Do you have any skills, something you could do for work?" "I was a teacher back east before I married Thomas. I can sew reasonably well." "I can cook and keep house." Hannah sighed. "But with a newborn. Have you spoken to Reverend Clark? The church sometimes helps folks in need." Hannah nodded. "He offered prayers and sympathy, but said the church coffers are empty after helping the McDaniels when their farm burned last month." Blake fell silent, eating his stew while clearly deep in thought. Hannah focused on her own meal, trying to eat enough to keep up her strength for Michael's sake. The baby stirred slightly in her arms but didn't wake. After several minutes, Blake set down his spoon. "I might have a proposition for you if you're willing to hear it." Hannah tensed slightly. She'd already received several propositions since Thomas's death, none of them honorable. "What kind of proposition?" Blake seemed to understand her wariness. "Nothing improper, I assure you. I own a small ranch about 2 days' ride from here. Nothing fancy, but it's good land with a solid house. I've been running it with just a couple of hands while I do the cattle drives, but I've been thinking it's time to spend more time there, build it up proper. Hannah waited, unsure where this was leading. The thing is, Blake continued, the place needs a woman's touch, and I could use someone to keep house, cook for the men when they're working the ranch. There's a small room off the kitchen that would suit you and the baby just fine. You're offering me work. As a housekeeper, Blake nodded. Room and board for you and your son plus wages. It's not much, but it's honest work and you'd have time to care for your baby. He hesitated. At least until you decide what you want to do long term. Hannah studied him, trying to determine if there was some hidden meaning behind his words. Why would you do this? You don't know me. Blake's blue eyes met hers steadily. Because I know what it's like to be alone with nowhere to turn. And because I meant what I said to those folks earlier, no woman should have to stand alone while she grieves. He smiled slightly. Besides, my men are tired of my cooking, and I suspect you'd do a sight better job of it. Hannah couldn't help the small smile that tugged at her lips. I'm sure that's true. She looked down at Michael, considering her options. Working as a housekeeper for a bachelor rancher might raise eyebrows, but starving on the streets with her baby would be worse. Would there be other women around? My nearest neighbor is the widow Carson. She's about 5 miles down the road with her 2 grown sons. Good woman, comes by to trade eggs for beef now and then. Blake leaned forward. I know it's not ideal, but it would be respectable. You'd have your own space, and I give you my word you'd be treated properly. Hannah took a deep breath. When would you want to leave? Day after tomorrow. I need to finish some business in town first, and that would give you time to gather your things. Blake hesitated. If you accept, that is. Hannah looked around the small cafe, then down at her sleeping son. She had no home, little money, and a child to care for. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. I accept your offer, Mr. Vance, she said finally. But I want to be clear I'm agreeing to be your housekeeper, nothing more. Blake nodded solemnly. I understand completely, Miss O'Brien. And please call me Blake. Then you should call me Hannah. As they finished their meal, Hannah felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. She was putting her trust in a man she'd just met, taking her infant son to an unknown place miles from town. Yet something about Blake Vance's steady gaze and quiet strength made her believe he was trustworthy. At the very least, he had shown her the first real kindness she'd experienced since becoming a widow. Little did she know that this chance encounter on a dusty street would change the course of her life forever. The next day passed in a blur as Hannah prepared for the journey. Blake had given her money to purchase supplies she might need for herself and Michael, insisting it was an advance on her wages. She bought cloth diapers, a warmer blanket for the baby, and some personal items she couldn't do without. Mrs. Perkins, the boarding house owner, raised her eyebrows when Hannah explained her new position. Going to work for Blake Vance, are you? Well, I suppose there are worse fates for a young widow. He's got a good reputation, that one. Never causes trouble when he's in town, pays his bills promptly. You know him well? Hannah asked, carefully folding her few possessions into her trunk. Mrs. Perkins shrugged. As well as anyone in Silverline knows him, keeps to himself mostly, but he's fair in his dealings. His ranch isn't the biggest, but they say he's built it up proper over the last few years. Started with almost nothing, from what I hear. This information reassured Hannah somewhat. At least she wasn't going to work for someone with a questionable reputation. His men respect him, Mrs. Perkins continued. That says something about a man's character. Hannah nodded, tucking away this knowledge along with her spare dress. The morning of their departure arrived with a clear sky and mild temperature, perfect for traveling. Blake appeared at the boarding house promptly at 8, driving a wagon rather than riding his horse. Thought this would be more comfortable for you and the little one, he explained as he loaded Hannah's trunk into the back. He had lined a small wooden crate with blankets to make a bed for Michael, securing it carefully so it wouldn't shift during the journey. Hannah settled herself on the wagon seat, cradling Michael in her arms. The baby was alert this morning, his blue eyes taking in the world around him with what Hannah fancied was curiosity. He seems to be in good spirits today, Blake commented as he climbed up beside her. Yes, he had a good night, only woke twice to feed. Hannah adjusted the blanket around Michael. I hope he travels well. Babies are tougher than they look, Blake said, taking up the reins, and we'll stop often enough to give both of you a rest. As they pulled away from the boarding house, Hannah felt a strange sense of finality. She had come to Silverline full of hope for her future with Thomas. Now she was leaving as a widow, with an infant son and an uncertain path ahead. She cast one last look at the town before facing forward toward whatever awaited her at Blake Vance's ranch. They traveled steadily throughout the day, stopping periodically to rest the horses and allow Hannah to tend to Michael's needs. Blake was respectful of her privacy when she needed to feed the baby, always finding some task that required his attention some distance from the wagon. As the afternoon wore on, Hannah found herself studying Blake when he wasn't looking. There was a quietness about him that she found reassuring. He didn't feel the need to fill every silence with chatter. When he did speak, his words were thoughtful and direct. He pointed out landmarks as they traveled, telling her bits of history about the territory that revealed his deep knowledge of the land. "How long have you been in Wyoming?" she asked as they stopped by a creek to water the horses. "Going on 10 years now," Blake replied, loosening the harness to give the animals a break. "Came up from Texas when I was 20 working cattle drives, fell in love with this country and decided to stay." "And your family," Hannah ventured, a shadow crossed Blake's face. "Lost my parents young. Was raised by my uncle, but he passed on years ago." "I'm sorry," Hannah said softly, understanding the look of old grief in his eyes. Blake nodded, acknowledging her sympathy without dwelling on it. "What about you? You mentioned Boston." "Yes, I grew up there. My parents died in a fever epidemic when I was 16. I lived with my mother's sister until I met Thomas." Hannah stroked Michael's cheek as he slept in her arms. "Thomas wanted adventure, a chance to make our fortune in the West. He convinced me that Wyoming held more promise than Boston." "And now," Blake asked quietly, Hannah looked out across the vast landscape stretching to the horizon. "Now I just want to give Michael a chance at a good life. That's all that matters." As the sun began to sink lower in the sky, Blake directed the wagon off the main trail toward a stand of cottonwood trees. "We'll camp here for the night," he explained. "It's a good spot, sheltered from the wind with the creek nearby for water." Hannah nodded, trying to hide her nervousness. She'd never spent a night outdoors before, not even during her journey west with Thomas. They had always stayed in towns or way stations. Blake seemed to sense her unease. "I'll set up a separate sleeping area for you and Michael under the wagon. It'll give you privacy and protection from any dew." He efficiently unloaded what they needed for the night: a small cook stove, provisions, bedrolls, and a canvas tarp. Hannah watched in admiration as he quickly established their camp, starting a small fire and setting up a comfortable space for her and Michael beneath the wagon. "I hope you don't mind beans and bacon for supper," Blake said as he worked over the small stove. "Not much variety on the trail." "It smells wonderful," Hannah assured him, realizing she was genuinely hungry after the day's journey. Michael had awakened and was fussing softly, ready for his own meal. "Would you mind if I—" "Go ahead and tend to him," Blake said, turning his attention deliberately to the food. "I'll let you know when supper's ready." Hannah sat with her back to Blake as she nursed Michael, grateful for his consideration. The baby fed hungrily, his tiny hand resting against her breast. Hannah marveled at how completely her life now revolved around this small being. Every decision she made was for his future, including accepting Blake's offer of employment. Once Michael was fed and changed into a fresh diaper, Hannah rejoined Blake by the fire. He handed her a tin plate of beans and bacon, along with a cup of strong coffee. "Thank you," she said, settling Michael in the crook of her arm while she ate with her free hand. They ate in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the distant call of a night bird. "May I ask you something?" Hannah said eventually. Blake nodded. "Of course. Why don't you have a wife to run your household, a man with his own ranch?" Blake poked at the fire with a stick, sending up a spray of sparks. "Never found the right woman, I suppose. Been too busy building something worth having." He glanced at her. "What about you? Will you look to marry again once your mourning time has passed?" Hannah considered the question. "I hadn't thought that far ahead. Right now, Michael needs all my attention." "Fair enough," Blake said, not pressing the issue. As darkness fell completely, the stars emerged in breathtaking profusion overhead. Hannah gasped softly at the sight. "You don't see stars like this in the city," Blake commented, following her gaze upward. "No, you certainly don't." Hannah felt a sense of wonder despite her circumstances. "It's beautiful, that it is." Blake finished his coffee and stood. "We should turn in. Morning comes early on the trail." He showed Hannah how to arrange her bedding beneath the wagon, making sure she and Michael would be comfortable and warm for the night. He had placed his own bedroll on the opposite side of the fire, giving her space while remaining close enough should she need anything. "Sleep well, Hannah," he said as he tipped his hat and retreated to his own bed. "You too, Blake," she replied, settling beneath the wagon with Michael nestled beside her. As she lay looking up at the stars through the gaps in the wagon bed, Hannah found herself thinking about the strange twist her life had taken. A week ago, she had been a grieving widow with no prospects. Now she was traveling to a new home with a man she barely knew, yet somehow trusted. Michael made a soft sound in his sleep, and Hannah turned to watch his peaceful face in the faint light of the dying fire. For him, she would make this work. She would build a new life, one day at a time. With that resolve firmly in mind, Hannah closed her eyes and fell into a deep, exhausted sleep beneath the Wyoming sky. The second day of travel dawned clear and cool. Hannah awoke to the smell of coffee and bacon, finding Blake already up and preparing breakfast. Michael had slept remarkably well for a baby on the trail, waking only twice during the night to feed. "Good morning," Blake greeted her as she emerged from beneath the wagon with Michael in her arms. "Hope you slept all right." "Better than I expected," Hannah admitted, accepting the cup of coffee he offered. "Thank you." They ate a quick breakfast, packed up camp efficiently, and were on the road again before the sun had risen fully above the horizon. The landscape changed gradually as they traveled, the open plains giving way to more varied terrain with rolling hills and stands of pine and aspen. "We'll reach the ranch by sundown," Blake told her as they stopped to rest the horses around midday. "It's in a small valley with good protection from winter winds, has its own creek running through the property." Hannah nodded, trying to picture her new home. "How many men work for you?" "Just 2 full-time brothers named Hank and Charlie Mitchell. Good men, been with me for 3 years now. I hire extra hands during roundup and branding season." Blake handed her a canteen of water. "They live in the bunkhouse about 100 yards from the main house. They won't bother you none." "And what will my duties be, exactly?" Hannah asked, wanting to be clear about her position. "Cooking for the men and myself, keeping the house in order. Nothing too taxing. The house isn't grand, just 4 rooms downstairs and 2 up. I've been managing it myself, but..." He shrugged. "A woman's touch would improve things considerably." Hannah nodded, feeling somewhat reassured. The arrangement seemed straightforward enough. They continued their journey through the afternoon, the horses maintaining a steady pace. Michael was remarkably patient, sleeping for much of the time and waking only to be fed or changed. Hannah found herself increasingly comfortable in Blake's company, appreciating his quiet competence and consideration. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Blake pointed ahead. "There it is, Vance Ranch." Hannah looked where he indicated and saw a valley opening up before them, with a modest but well-built house nestled against a backdrop of pine trees. A creek ran through the property, catching the late afternoon sunlight. There was a large barn, corrals, and what she assumed was the bunkhouse a short distance from the main house. It wasn't grand or imposing, but something about the scene made Hannah catch her breath. After weeks of uncertainty and grief, the neat ranch with its solid buildings looked like a haven of stability. "It's lovely," she said sincerely. Blake's expression softened with pride. "Started with just the land and built everything myself with some help from the Mitchell brothers. Took 4 years to get it how I wanted it." As they approached, Hannah saw 2 men emerge from the barn, shading their eyes against the setting sun to watch their arrival. When they recognized Blake, they raised their hands in greeting. "That's Hank and Charlie," Blake explained. "Hank's the taller one with the beard. Charlie's younger by 2 years." The wagon rolled into the yard, and Blake brought it to a halt near the front porch of the main house. The Mitchell brothers approached, both looking curiously at Hannah and the baby. Boss, Hank greeted Blake with a nod. Good to have you back. Drive go all right, smooth as could be, Blake replied, jumping down from the wagon. Boys, I'd like you to meet Miss Hannah O'Brien and her son Michael. Miss O'Brien will be keeping house for us from now on. Hannah nodded politely as both men removed their hats. Madam, they said almost in unison, seeming somewhat in awe of her presence. Pleasure to meet you both, Hannah replied, adjusting Michael in her arms. Hank, give me a hand with Miss O'Brien's trunk, Blake instructed. Charlie, see to the horses, will you? Both men moved quickly to comply, and Blake came around to help Hannah down from the wagon. His hand was strong and steady as he assisted her, careful of the baby in her arms. Let me show you the house, he said, leading her toward the porch steps. The house was simple but solidly built, with a covered porch running along the front. Blake opened the door and ushered Hannah inside. The main room served as both parlor and dining area, with a large stone fireplace on one wall. The furniture was plain but well made, a sturdy table with 6 chairs, a sofa and 2 armchairs near the fireplace, and bookshelves containing a surprising number of volumes. Kitchen's through here, Blake said, leading her through a doorway. The kitchen was spacious by frontier standards, with a large cast iron stove, a sink with a pump for water, ample cupboards, and a work table in the center. A window above the sink looked out toward the barn and corrals. And this would be your room, he continued, opening a door off the kitchen to reveal a small but comfortable bedroom. It contained a single bed, a dresser, and a rocking chair near the window. I thought the proximity to the kitchen would be convenient for your work, and the rocking chair might be useful with the baby. Hannah stepped into the room, deeply touched by the thoughtfulness of the arrangement. This will be perfect, thank you. There's a pantry and storeroom on the other side of the kitchen, Blake explained. Upstairs are 2 bedrooms, mine and a spare. There's a washroom off the back porch with a big tub for bathing. He showed her the rest of the house, and Hannah was impressed by how well organized and clean it was, even without a woman's touch. Blake clearly took pride in his home. I'll have the boys bring in your trunk and fetch some hot water if you'd like to freshen up, Blake offered. I imagine you're tired after 2 days on the trail. That would be wonderful, Hannah admitted, suddenly aware of the dust of travel on her skin and clothes. While Hank brought in her trunk and Charlie carried buckets of heated water to fill the bathtub, Blake showed Hannah the pantry and storeroom, making sure she knew where everything was located. We usually eat breakfast at sunrise, dinner at noon, and supper around sundown, he explained. But don't worry about cooking tonight. I picked up supplies in town that'll do us fine. After the men had gone Hank and Charlie to the bunkhouse, Blake to tend to some chore in the barn, Hannah took the opportunity to bathe herself and Michael. The warm water was heavenly after 2 days of travel, and Michael seemed to enjoy it too, his little legs kicking in the shallow water as she gently washed him. Once they were both clean and dressed in fresh clothes, Hannah ventured into the kitchen to see what Blake had planned for supper. She found him there, slicing bread to go with the cheese, cold meat, and canned peaches he had set out. I hope this will do for tonight, he said, looking almost apologetic. It's not much of a welcome meal. It looks perfect, Hannah assured him, settling Michael in the crook of her arm. May I help? No need. You must be exhausted. Please sit. He pulled out a chair at the kitchen table for her. As they ate their simple meal, Blake explained more about the ranch, how many cattle he ran, the seasonal rhythm of the work, his plans for expanding over the next few years. Hannah listened attentively, asking questions that showed her genuine interest. And you'll be heading back on the trail soon, she asked as they finished their meal. Blake shook his head. Not until spring. I've decided to stay put for a while, work on improving the ranch. The last drive was profitable enough to give me some breathing room. Hannah nodded, feeling relieved that she wouldn't be left alone with just the Mitchell brothers for company. As kind as Blake seemed, she was still adjusting to her new circumstances and appreciated having the ranch owner nearby while she settled in. After supper, Hannah insisted on cleaning up despite Blake's protests. I need to learn where everything goes, she pointed out reasonably. And you've hired me to keep house, after all, Blake conceded with a smile. Fair enough, I'll be on the porch if you need anything. As Hannah washed the few dishes, she could see Blake through the window, sitting in a chair on the porch with his boots propped up on the railing, smoking a cigarette and looking out over his land in the fading light. There was something in his posture, a quiet contentment, a sense of belonging that touched her deeply. When she had finished in the kitchen, Hannah joined him on the porch, Michael sleeping peacefully in her arms. "Everything all right with your room?" Blake asked as she settled into the chair beside him. "It's perfect, thank you." Hannah gazed out at the view, drinking in the peaceful scene. The sun had set, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. "You have a beautiful place here." "It's not much compared to some of the big ranches, but it's mine." Blake's voice held quiet pride. "Built it from nothing but hard work and determination. That's something to be proud of," Hannah said sincerely. They sat in companionable silence as darkness fell completely, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Hannah stifled a yawn. "You should get some rest," Blake said, noticing her fatigue. "It's been a long few days for you." Hannah nodded, rising from her chair. "Thank you again, Blake." "For everything." "No need for thanks, we made a fair arrangement." He tipped his hat to her. "Sleep well, Hannah." In her small room off the kitchen, Hannah settled Michael in the center of the bed, surrounding him with pillows to keep him from rolling. She changed into her nightgown and slipped beneath the covers beside her son, marveling at the strange turn her life had taken. A week ago, she had been a grieving widow with nowhere to go. Now she had a roof over her head, honest work, and the beginnings of what might become a stable life for herself and Michael. It wasn't the future she had envisioned when she married Thomas, but perhaps it could be a good life nonetheless. With that hopeful thought, Hannah drifted into sleep, the soft sounds of the Wyoming night a gentle lullaby. The following weeks established a routine that gave Hannah's life a much-needed structure. She rose early each morning to prepare breakfast for Blake and the Mitchell brothers, feeding Michael before the men arrived from the bunkhouse. The men would eat quickly, discussing the day's work as they did so, before heading out to tend to the cattle and other ranch chores. Hannah spent her mornings cleaning the house, doing laundry, and baking bread or preparing the midday meal. Michael was a good baby, content to lie in his makeshift cradle, a dresser drawer lined with blankets that Blake had set up for him while Hannah worked. She often sang to him as she moved about the house, old lullabies her mother had sung to her. Blake usually returned to the house for the noon meal, though Hank and Charlie sometimes ate sandwiches in the field if work kept them far from the main house. In the afternoons, Hannah would tend to mending clothes, preserving food from Blake's well-stocked root cellar, or working in the small kitchen garden behind the house. She prepared supper in the late afternoon, timing it to be ready when the men finished their day's work. The evenings followed a quiet pattern. After the dishes were washed and put away, Hannah would often sit on the porch with Michael if the weather was mild, or by the fire in the main room if it was cold. Blake sometimes joined her, reading from one of his books or simply sitting in companionable silence. Hank and Charlie usually returned to the bunkhouse after supper unless Blake invited them to stay for a game of cards. As October gave way to November, the days grew shorter and the nights colder. Hannah found herself looking forward to the quiet evenings by the fire, particularly when Blake was there. He was a thoughtful conversationalist, well-read despite his lack of formal education, and he never seemed to tire of her questions about ranch life or the history of the territory. For his part, Blake appeared to enjoy having Hannah and Michael in his home. He often commented on how much he appreciated her cooking after years of bachelor fare, and he took obvious pleasure in the small touches she added to make the house more comfortable: curtains sewn from fabric she found in the storeroom, wildflowers arranged in mason jars, the aroma of fresh baked bread filling the kitchen. One cold evening in mid-November, Blake returned from Silverline with supplies and a special surprise: a proper cradle for Michael. "The carpenter in town made it," Blake explained somewhat self-consciously as Hank helped him carry it into the house. "Figured the little fella could use something better than a drawer to sleep in." Hannah ran her hand over the smooth wood, touched beyond words by the gesture. "It's beautiful, Blake, thank you." "It's nothing," he mumbled, clearly embarrassed by her gratitude. "Just practical is all." But Hannah knew it was more than that. The cradle was finely crafted, with a gentle curve that would allow it to rock soothingly. It must have cost a fair amount more than was practical for a temporary arrangement with a housekeeper. That night, after Michael was settled in his new cradle and the house had grown quiet, Hannah sat by the fire with Blake, a comfortable silence between them. "May I ask you something?" she ventured finally. Blake looked up from the book he'd been reading. "Of course." "Why did you really offer me this position? There must be women in Silverline who could have kept house for you without the complication of a newborn." Blake closed his book, considering her question. "Do you remember what I told you when we first met?" "About someone helping me when I needed it most," Hannah nodded. "When I first came to Wyoming, I was young and foolish. Got caught in a blizzard my first winter here, would have died for sure if an old rancher hadn't found me and taken me in." Blake's eyes grew distant with memory. "He and his wife nursed me back to health, then gave me work when I had nothing. Taught me everything I know about ranching." He paused, gazing into the fire. "They passed on 5 years ago. Influenza took them both within days of each other. Left me their small herd and enough money to buy this land." Blake looked up at Hannah. "I promised myself I'd honor their memory by helping others when I could, the way they helped me." Hannah was moved by his story. "They would be proud of what you've built here." "I hope so." Blake smiled slightly. "But there's more to it than just repaying an old debt. When I saw you standing in that street with your baby being mocked when you were at your lowest." His jaw tightened at the memory. "Something in me couldn't walk away, and I haven't regretted it for a moment." Their eyes met across the space between their chairs, and Hannah felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. There was a sincerity in Blake's gaze that touched something deep within her, something she had thought died with Thomas. The moment was broken by Michael's cry from the bedroom. Hannah rose quickly. "I should feed him." Blake nodded, picking up his book again. "Good night, Hannah." "Good night, Blake." As Hannah nursed Michael in the privacy of her room, she found her thoughts returning to Blake and the look they had shared by the fire. She was not so naive as to misunderstand what had passed between them, a spark of something more than friendship, more than the arrangement between employer and employee. But was she ready for such feelings? Thomas had been gone barely 3 months. The wound of his loss was still fresh, the grief still a daily companion. And yet, there was no denying the comfort and security she felt in Blake's presence, the way her heart lifted when he smiled at her or showed kindness to Michael. "What would your father think of all this?" she whispered to her son, who gazed up at her with Thomas's eyes. Would he understand that life must go on? Michael's only response was to continue nursing contentedly, oblivious to his mother's conflicted heart. As winter tightened its grip on the Wyoming Territory, Hannah found herself increasingly grateful for the shelter of Blake's ranch. Snow blanketed the valley, turning the landscape into a pristine white expanse broken only by the dark shapes of pine trees and the ranch buildings. The creek froze over, and the cattle huddled in sheltered areas, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Inside the house, however, it was warm and comfortable. Blake had laid in ample supplies before the worst of the weather hit: flour, sugar, coffee, canned goods, and a smokehouse full of cured meat. The root cellar was stocked with potatoes, carrots, onions, and apples. There was plenty of firewood stacked near the house and coal for the kitchen stove. With the outdoor work limited by the weather, Blake spent more time in the house. He took over a corner of the main room as a workshop, repairing tack, whittling new handles for tools, and carving small wooden toys for Michael, who was growing rapidly and becoming more alert each day. "He'll be sitting up on his own before long," Blake observed one afternoon as he watched Hannah playing with the baby on a blanket near the fire. Michael was reaching for a wooden horse Blake had carved for him, his chubby fingers grasping at the air. "Yes, he's getting stronger every day," Hannah agreed, pride evident in her voice. "And he's trying to roll over now. Watch." She demonstrated by gently turning Michael onto his stomach. The baby pushed up on his arms, his head lifted determinedly as he tried to flip himself back over, grunting with the effort. Blake laughed as Michael finally succeeded, flopping onto his back with a look of surprise. "Strong-willed little fella, isn't he?" "Like his father," Hannah said softly, a touch of sadness coloring her words. Blake's expression grew more serious. Tell me about him, your husband, if you don't mind talking about it, that is. Hannah hesitated, then nodded. In the months since Thomas's death, she had rarely spoken of him, finding the grief too raw. But now, in the warmth and safety of Blake's home, she found she wanted to share those memories. Thomas was a dreamer, she began, lifting Michael onto her lap. Always had big plans, always saw opportunity where others saw obstacles. He worked as a clerk in Boston but hated being cooped up indoors. When he heard about the silver strike in Wyoming, he was determined to go west. She smiled at the memory. I was teaching at a small school then. We'd been courting for almost a year when he proposed, said he wanted to make his fortune in the West, and build us a fine house with servants and silk curtains. Blake listened attentively, his hands continuing their work on a piece of leather he was mending. I knew it was a risk, Hannah continued, leaving everything familiar behind, but I loved him and I believed in his dreams. She stroked Michael's soft hair. We were married just before we left. The journey west was difficult, but Thomas never lost his enthusiasm. Even when we arrived and found that the silver boom wasn't quite what he'd imagined, he remained optimistic. That takes courage, Blake commented, to hold on to hope in the face of disappointment. Hannah nodded. He took the job at the mine as a temporary measure. Said he just needed to save enough to stake a claim of his own. Her voice caught slightly. He was so excited when I told him about the baby. Started making even bigger plans how our son would grow up to be a mining magnate or a railroad baron. Blake set aside his leather work and leaned forward. He sounds like a good man. He was. Hannah felt tears welling in her eyes, but they weren't as painful as before. He would have been a wonderful father. Without a word, Blake rose and fetched his handkerchief, offering it to her. Hannah took it gratefully, wiping her eyes. I'm sorry, she said. I didn't mean to burden you with my grief. It's no burden, Blake assured her, his voice gentle. Grief shared is grief halved, my mother used to say. Hannah looked up at him, touched by his understanding. What about you? Have you ever been in love? A shadow crossed Blake's face. Once, a long time ago. When he didn't continue, Hannah thought he might not want to elaborate, but after a moment he spoke again. Her name was Sarah, daughter of a rancher near Laramie. We met at a harvest dance when I was 24. Blake's eyes took on a faraway look. She had hair the color of wheat and laughed like she meant it. We courted for almost 2 years. What happened? Hannah asked softly. Diphtheria. Swept through the county and took her, along with her mother and younger brother. Blake's voice was steady, but Hannah could hear the old pain beneath the words. I just bought this land, was building the house for us. She never got to see it finished. Oh, Blake, I'm so sorry, he shrugged, as if to dispel the weight of the memory. It was 8 years ago. Life goes on, as they say. But Hannah understood now why Blake had never married, why there was sometimes a shadow behind his smile. He had built this ranch alone, carrying the dreams he had once shared with someone he loved. Thank you for telling me, she said quietly. Blake nodded, picking up his leatherwork again. They sat in companionable silence, each lost in thoughts of loves lost and futures altered. Outside, snow began to fall again, adding another layer to the white blanket covering the valley. Christmas approached, bringing with it a festive spirit despite the isolation of the ranch. Hannah was determined to make it special for Michael's first Christmas, even though the baby was too young to understand the significance. Blake surprised her by riding into Silverline despite the snow-packed trails, returning with a small fir tree strapped to his saddle and saddlebags full of Treats oranges, peppermint sticks, a tin of cocoa, and even a small gift wrapped in brown paper that he refused to let her see. It's for Christmas morning, he insisted, tucking it away in his room. Hannah, Hank, and Charlie decorated the tree with paper chains, strings of dried berries, and small ornaments Hannah crafted from scraps of fabric and bits of shiny tin. Blake watched their efforts with amusement, claiming he had no talent for such things, but Hannah noticed the way his eyes softened when he looked at the finished tree on Christmas Eve. Hank and Charlie joined them in the main house for a special supper. Hannah had outdone herself, preparing a roast chicken with all the trimmings, fresh bread, and an apple pie for dessert. Even Michael seemed to sense the festive atmosphere, cooing and smiling from his cradle. After the meal, they gathered around the fire. Charlie surprised everyone by producing a fiddle from beneath his coat. Thought a little music might be nice, he said shyly. If you don't mind, Miss Hannah. I'd love it, Hannah said warmly. I haven't heard music in ages. Charlie proved to be a talented fiddler, playing traditional carols and lively folk tunes that had them all tapping their feet. Hank revealed a surprisingly good singing voice, and even Blake was persuaded to join in on a few songs he knew. As the evening wore on, Hannah found herself watching Blake as he laughed at something Hank said, his face relaxed and open in a way she rarely saw. In the firelight, with the Christmas tree glowing in the corner and music filling the room, he looked younger, the cares of ranching temporarily set aside. When he caught her looking at him, he smiled a warm, genuine smile that reached his eyes and made Hannah's heart skip a beat. She quickly looked away, focusing on Michael, who had fallen asleep in her arms despite the noise. I should put him to bed, she said, rising from her chair. Let me help, Blake offered, standing to hold the door to her room open. Hannah laid Michael gently in his cradle, tucking the blanket around him. Blake stood in the doorway, watching. He's growing so fast, he commented softly. Hannah nodded, stroking Michael's cheek. Too fast. I can hardly believe he's almost 3 months old. You're doing a fine job with him, Hannah, Blake said earnestly. He's a lucky boy to have you for his mother. Hannah looked up, moved by the sincerity in his voice. Thank you. That means a great deal to me. Their eyes met and held for a long moment, and Hannah felt that same warmth she had experienced by the fire weeks earlier. There was something in Blake's gaze, a question, perhaps, or a hope that made her breath catch. The spell was broken by a burst of laughter from the main room as Hank apparently said something amusing. We should rejoin the others, Hannah said. Suddenly feeling shy, Blake nodded, stepping back to let her pass. As she did so, their hands brushed, and Hannah felt a jolt of awareness that left her flustered. The remainder of the evening passed pleasantly, but Hannah was acutely conscious of Blake's presence across the room. When Hank and Charlie finally bid them good night and returned to the bunkhouse, an awkward silence fell between Hannah and Blake. I should turn in as well, Hannah said, gathering the last of the cups and plates. It's been a lovely evening. Thank you for making it special. Blake helped her carry the dishes to the kitchen. It's been the best Christmas I've had in years, he said as they finished cleaning up. Having you and Michael here, he paused, seeming to search for the right words. It's made this house feel like a home. Hannah felt a blush rising to her cheeks. I'm glad. You've done so much for us. Merry Christmas, Hannah, Blake said softly. Merry Christmas, Blake. They stood looking at each other in the dim light of the kitchen, the rest of the house quiet except for the occasional pop from the dying fire. Hannah could feel her heart racing, aware that something significant was happening between them but uncertain whether to acknowledge it. Finally, Blake cleared his throat. Well, good night then. Good night, Hannah replied, watching as he turned and walked toward the stairs that led to his bedroom. Alone in her room, Hannah sat on the edge of her bed, her emotions in turmoil. There was no denying her growing feelings for Blake Vance. His kindness, his quiet strength, his obvious affection for Michael, all these things had worked their way into her heart over the past 2 months. But was it disloyal to Thomas to feel this way? Was it too soon to be thinking of another man? Hannah looked at Michael sleeping peacefully in his cradle, the cradle Blake had brought home especially for him. Her son deserved a father, someone to guide him, teach him, love him as his own. Blake already showed signs of caring deeply for the boy, and what of her own heart? Did she not deserve a chance at happiness again? With these questions circling in her mind, Hannah prepared for bed, listening to the soft sounds of the ranch at night, the distant howl of a wolf, the occasional creak of the house settling, the whisper of the wind across the snow. Tomorrow was Christmas, a day for new beginnings. Perhaps it would bring clarity to her confused heart. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold, the sun glinting off the snow-covered landscape with dazzling brightness. Hannah woke to find Michael already alert, kicking his legs and making happy, gurgling sounds in his cradle. "Merry Christmas, my sweet boy," she whispered, lifting him into her arms. After feeding and changing Michael, Hannah dressed in her best dress, a simple blue wool that brought out the color of her eyes. She pinned her hair up neatly, and even added a touch of rose water she had been saving for a special occasion. When she emerged from her room with Michael, she found Blake already up, stoking the fire in the main room. He had shaved and was wearing a clean shirt with his best trousers, his dark hair neatly combed. "Merry Christmas," he greeted her with a smile. "You look lovely." Hannah felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "Thank you. Merry Christmas to you too." Breakfast was a festive affair, with Hank and Charlie joining them for pancakes drizzled with precious maple syrup Blake had been saving for the occasion. Afterward, they gathered around the Christmas tree for the simple gift exchange. Hannah had made new shirts for each of the men, using fabric from the storeroom and working on them secretly during the evenings after they had gone to bed. For Michael, she had fashioned a soft toy from scraps of cloth, a little horse to match the wooden one Blake had carved for him. Hank and Charlie had whittled a set of wooden animals for Michael and brought Hannah a beautiful shawl made by a Shoshone woman who sometimes traded with the ranchers in the area. For Blake, they had crafted a new leather belt with an ornate buckle. When it came time for Blake's gifts, he seemed almost nervous. He gave Hank and Charlie each a new knife and a bottle of whiskey, which they received with enthusiasm. For Michael, he had carved a rocking horse, small but perfectly formed, which the baby would be able to use once he could sit up properly. Finally, Blake handed Hannah the small package wrapped in brown paper that he had kept hidden. "It's not much," he said apologetically. Hannah carefully unwrapped it to find a small leather-bound book. Opening it, she discovered it was a journal, its pages blank and waiting. "I thought you might like to write down your thoughts," Blake explained, "or keep a record of Michael's growing up." The storekeeper in Silverline said ladies enjoy such things. Hannah ran her fingers over the soft leather cover, deeply touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "It's perfect, Blake, thank you." As she looked up at him, their eyes met, and Hannah saw something in Blake's gaze that made her heart beat faster, a tenderness, a hope, a question he wasn't yet ready to ask. The moment was interrupted by a knock at the door. Blake frowned, clearly not expecting visitors on Christmas Day. Who could that be? Hannah wondered aloud. Blake went to answer the door, returning a moment later with Widow Carson and her two grown sons behind him. "Mrs. Carson," Blake said, "what a pleasant surprise." The widow, a robust woman in her 50s with salt and pepper hair, stamped the snow from her boots. "Merry Christmas to you all. We were on our way to visit the Hendersons and thought we'd stop by. Brought you some of my special Christmas bread." She handed Blake a cloth-wrapped loaf, then turned curious eyes on Hannah and Michael. "And who might this be?" "This is Miss Hannah O'Brien and her son Michael," Blake introduced them. "Hannah, this is Mrs. Abigail Carson and her sons Peter and James, Mrs." Carson studied Hannah with open interest. "Blake's housekeeper, are you? Well, it's about time he got someone to look after this place properly, and with a baby too. How old is the little one?" 3 months, Hannah replied, somewhat taken aback by the woman's directness, Mrs. Carson nodded approvingly. "Fine-looking boy, and you, my dear, are a sight for sore eyes. It's been too long since we had a young woman in the valley." Blake invited the Carsons to stay for coffee and Christmas bread, and soon the house was filled with conversation and laughter. Hannah found Mrs. Carson to be kind beneath her forthright manner, and the older woman seemed genuinely pleased to have another female to talk to. "You must come visit us," Mrs. Carson insisted as they prepared to leave an hour later. "It's only 5 miles, and the boys would be happy to fetch you with the sleigh anytime." "That's very kind of you," Hannah said, meaning it. The prospect of female companionship was appealing after months with only men for company. After the Carsons had departed, Hank and Charlie excused themselves to return to the bunkhouse, leaving Blake and Hannah alone with Michael. "I hope Mrs. Carson didn't overwhelm you," Blake said as they settled by the fire. "She can be rather direct," Hannah smiled. "I liked her." "It's nice to know there are other women nearby," Blake nodded, looking thoughtful. "I should have introduced you sooner. It didn't occur to me you might be missing female company." "I've been too busy to notice, honestly," Hannah assured him, "but it will be nice to visit her sometime." They spent the rest of Christmas Day in pleasant conversation, enjoying the rare luxury of a day without work. Blake played with Michael on the rug near the fire, showing surprising patience as the baby grabbed at his fingers and clothes. Watching them together, Hannah felt a surge of emotion so strong it nearly brought tears to her eyes. In just 2 months, Blake had become such an important part of their lives. He treated Michael with a tenderness that belied his rough exterior, and his consideration for Hannah went far beyond what an employer owed an employee. As the short winter day faded into dusk, Hannah prepared a light supper of leftover chicken and Christmas bread. They ate by firelight, the room cozy and warm despite the frigid temperatures outside. "This has been the best Christmas I can remember," Blake said as they finished their meal. Hannah smiled. "For me too. I wasn't sure how I would feel, with it being the first Christmas without Thomas and Michael's first Christmas ever, but you've made it special." Blake's expression grew serious. "Hannah, there's something I've been wanting to say to you." Her heart quickened at his tone. "Yes." Blake seemed to struggle with his words. "These past 2 months, having you and Michael here, it's changed things for me, changed me." He looked down at his hands, then back up at her. "I know it might be too soon. I know you're still grieving Thomas, but I care for you, Hannah. More than I should as your employer." Hannah's breath caught in her throat. She had suspected Blake's feelings were growing, just as hers were, but hearing him speak them aloud made them real in a way she hadn't been prepared for. "Blake, you don't need to say anything," he interrupted gently. "I don't expect anything from you. I just wanted you to know that whatever happens, you and Michael have a home here for as long as you want it, no matter what." Hannah felt tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "I care for you too, Blake, very much, but you're right, it is soon. I'm still trying to make sense of everything that's happened." Blake nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I know, and I'm willing to wait, Hannah, for as long as it takes." The sincerity in his voice touched her deeply. This was a man who understood patience, who knew that some things were worth waiting for. "Thank you for understanding," Hannah said softly. Blake reached across the table and gently took her hand in his. "Merry Christmas, Hannah O'Brien. Merry Christmas, Blake Vance." Their hands remained joined as the fire crackled in the hearth, and the stars appeared one by one in the clear Wyoming sky. Winter gradually gave way to spring, the snow melting to reveal patches of mud and then tender green grass. The creek swelled with snowmelt, running fast and clear through the valley. Calving season arrived, keeping Blake and the Mitchell brothers busy day and night, often returning to the house exhausted but satisfied with the growing herd. Hannah settled more deeply into life at the ranch, finding fulfillment in her work and joy in watching Michael grow. He was sitting up now, babbling happily and reaching for everything in sight. His first tooth had appeared in March, causing several sleepless nights, but ultimately another milestone to celebrate. True to her word, Mrs. Carson had sent her sons with the sleigh to bring Hannah and Michael for visits several times during the winter months. Hannah found these outings a welcome change from the routine of the ranch, and Mrs. Carson proved to be a wealth of practical knowledge about frontier life and raising children. "Blake Vance is sweet on you, Mrs. Carson observed bluntly during one such visit in early April as they sat shelling peas on her porch while Michael napped nearby. Hannah felt her cheeks warm. "He's been very kind to us," Mrs. Carson snorted. "Kind indeed. The man looks at you like a starving man eyes a feast." She paused in her work, fixing Hannah with a direct gaze. "And how do you feel about him?" Hannah hesitated, uncertain how much to confide, but there was something about Mrs. Carson's straightforward manner that invited honesty. "I care for him," Hannah admitted. "More than I expected to, so soon after losing Thomas." Mrs. Carson nodded, resuming her shelling. "Grief and love aren't mutually exclusive, you know. Your heart's big enough for both. But is it disloyal to Thomas?" Hannah asked, voicing the question that had troubled her through the winter months. "Would Thomas want you and that boy to be alone?" Mrs. Carson countered. "Or would he want you to find happiness again with a good man who clearly adores both of you?" Put that way, the answer seemed obvious. Thomas had always wanted her happiness above all else. "Blake is a fine man," Mrs. Carson continued. "Been alone too long, lost someone special years back from what I hear." "Yes, he told me about Sarah," Hannah said softly. "Did he now?" Mrs. Carson raised her eyebrows. "He doesn't speak of her to many. That tells me something right there." Hannah pondered this as they finished shelling the peas. Blake's confidence about Sarah had indeed been a sign of trust, a sharing of the pain that had shaped him, just as she had shared her grief over Thomas with him. When she and Michael returned to the ranch that evening, Hannah found herself seeing Blake with new eyes. He had been out checking the north pasture all day, but had returned in time for supper. As he sat at the table, telling her about the new calves and the condition of the grass, Hannah noticed the fine lines around his eyes, the strength in his hands, the way his voice softened when he asked about Michael's day. This was a man who had suffered loss, just as she had, yet had built something meaningful with his life. A man who offered security without demanding dependency, who showed affection without expectation. A man, Hannah realized with sudden clarity, whom she was falling in love with. The knowledge both thrilled and frightened her. It had been just 6 months since Thomas's death. Was her heart truly ready for this new feeling? As if sensing her thoughts, Blake looked up from his coffee. "Everything all right, Hannah? You're quiet tonight." "Just thinking," she replied, offering a small smile. "Mrs. Carson sends her regards. She says the wildflowers will be blooming soon in the high meadow. Apparently it's quite a sight." "She's right about that," Blake agreed. "First week of May usually brings a carpet of color. Maybe we could ride up there when the time comes. Take a picnic lunch." The invitation hung in the air between them, significant in a way that a simple outing shouldn't be. Hannah knew Blake was offering more than just a chance to see wildflowers. He was suggesting their first deliberate time alone together, away from the ranch and its daily routines. "I'd like that," Hannah said softly. "Very much." The smile that spread across Blake's face warmed her to her core. "It's a date, then." The word date lingered in Hannah's mind long after Blake had gone to check on a new calf in the barn. A date, like courting, like beginning something new. As spring advanced, bringing warmer days and fragrant breezes, Hannah found herself looking forward to the promised outing with increasing anticipation. Blake had been true to his word about waiting, never pressing her for more than she was ready to give. Their relationship had deepened through the winter months, built on shared work, quiet conversations by the fire, and their mutual affection for Michael. The baby, now nearly 6 months old, had become a source of delight for everyone at the ranch. He was trying to crawl, rocking back and forth on his hands and knees, but not quite managing to move forward yet. His laughter was infectious, especially when Blake played peekaboo with him or lifted him high in the air to his squealing delight. On the first Saturday in May, Hannah awoke to find Blake already up and preparing for their outing. He had saddled 2 horses, his own stallion and a gentle mare for Hannah, and packed a picnic lunch in saddlebags. "Are you sure Hank and Charlie won't mind watching Michael?" Hannah asked as she prepared to leave, feeling both excited and guilty about the planned outing. "They're looking forward to it," Blake assured her. "Charlie's been practicing his silly faces all week to make the little fella laugh." As if to confirm this, Charlie made a ridiculous expression at Michael, who was sitting in his lap, causing the baby to giggle uncontrollably. "See, they'll be fine," Blake said with a smile. "We'll only be gone a few hours." Reassured, Hannah kissed Michael goodbye and allowed Blake to help her mount the mare. It had been months since she'd been on horseback, not since before Michael was born, but the skill came back quickly. They rode at a leisurely pace through the valley and up into the foothills where Blake had promised the wildflowers would be blooming. The day was perfect warm sunshine, a gentle breeze, and clear blue skies. Hannah felt a lightness of spirit she hadn't experienced in a long time. "It's just over this rise," Blake said as they approached a hill covered in pine trees. As they crested the hill, Hannah gasped at the sight that spread before them. A high meadow stretched toward distant mountains, and it was indeed carpeted with wildflowers, blue lupines, orange paintbrush, yellow balsam root, and dozens of other varieties she couldn't name, creating a riot of color against the green grass. "Oh, Blake," she breathed. "It's beautiful." Blake smiled, clearly pleased by her reaction. "Worth the ride? Absolutely." They dismounted at the edge of the meadow, letting the horses graze while Blake spread a blanket in a sunny spot surrounded by flowers. The picnic he had packed was simple but thoughtful: cold chicken, bread, cheese, apples, and a special treat of chocolate he'd purchased on his last trip to Silverline. As they ate, Hannah found herself relaxing completely for the first time in months. Away from the ranch and its constant reminders of responsibilities, she could simply enjoy Blake's company, the beautiful surroundings, and the moment itself. "Penny for your thoughts," Blake said as they finished their meal. Hannah smiled, leaning back on her hands to look up at the sky. "I was just thinking how peaceful it is here, how perfect this day is." "It is that," Blake agreed, his eyes on her rather than the scenery. Hannah met his gaze, feeling a flutter of anticipation in her stomach. There was no mistaking the look in his eyes now, desire mingled with deep affection. "Hannah," he said softly, "I've been patient because I respect your grief and I know you needed time, but my feelings haven't changed. If anything, they've grown stronger with each passing day." Hannah's heart raced as Blake moved closer, taking her hand in his. "I love you, Hannah O'Brien," he said simply. "You and Michael both. I want you to stay at the ranch not as my housekeeper but as my wife, if you'll have me." Though she had sensed this moment coming, the actual words still took her breath away. Blake Vance loved her, wanted to marry her. "Wanted to be a father to Michael. Blake," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "these past months with you have been healing. You've given us a home when we had none, security when we were adrift. You've been so patient, so kind." Blake waited, his expression hopeful but uncertain. "I will always love Thomas," Hannah continued carefully. "He gave me Michael, and I'll never forget him." "I would never ask you to," Blake assured her quickly. Hannah smiled, squeezing his hand. "I know, and that's one of the reasons I've fallen in love with you, Blake Vance. Your understanding, your kindness, your strength." Blake's eyes widened. "You love me." "I do," Hannah said, feeling the truth of it in every fiber of her being. "I love you, and I would be honored to be your wife." The joy that spread across Blake's face was beautiful to behold. He lifted her hand to his lips, kissing it reverently. "May I kiss you, Hannah?" he asked, his voice husky with emotion. In answer, Hannah leaned forward, closing the distance between them. Their lips met in a gentle kiss that quickly deepened, years of loneliness and months of growing affection finding expression in this tender moment. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Blake rested his forehead against hers. "I promise to be a good husband to you, Hannah. And a good father to Michael." "I know you will," Hannah whispered. "You already are." They spent the remainder of the afternoon in the meadow, talking about their future together, plans for the ranch, for Michael, for the family they hoped to build. When the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, they reluctantly packed up their picnic and mounted their horses for the ride home. As they approached the ranch, Hannah felt a sense of rightness, of coming home in more ways than one. The house where she had arrived as a grieving widow had become the place where she had found love again, where her heart had healed enough to open to new possibilities. Blake helped her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist. "Shall we tell them?" he asked, nodding toward the house where Hank and Charlie were presumably still watching Michael. Hannah nodded, happiness bubbling up inside her. "Yes, let's tell them." Hand in hand, they walked toward the house, ready to begin their new life together. The news of their engagement was met with whoops of joy from Hank and Charlie, who admitted they had been hoping for this outcome for months. "About time, boss," Hank said, slapping Blake on the back. "We were wondering how long it would take you to speak up." Mrs. Carson, upon hearing the news during her next visit, was equally delighted but less surprised. "I knew it the first time I saw you two together," she declared. "Some things are just meant to be." They decided on a June wedding, to be held at the ranch with Reverend Clark coming from Silverline to perform the ceremony. Hannah wanted a simple affair, with just their closest friends in attendance. After losing so much, the prospect of gaining a husband and a secure future for her son was celebration enough. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, Hannah divided her time between her usual duties and preparing for the ceremony. Mrs. Carson and her sons helped with the arrangements, bringing flowers from their garden and helping Blake and the Mitchell brothers construct tables and benches for the guests. Hannah used some of the money she had saved from her wages to purchase fabric for a new dress, a soft blue that matched her eyes. She worked on it in the evenings after Michael was asleep, enjoying the quiet anticipation of creating something special for her wedding day. Blake, meanwhile, threw himself into preparations with unexpected enthusiasm. He built a larger bed for what would become their shared bedroom upstairs, enlarged the corral for the growing herd, and even repainted the front porch. "You don't have to do all this," Hannah told him one evening as they sat on the newly painted porch watching the sunset. "I want our home to be perfect for you," Blake replied, taking her hand in his. "For both of you." Hannah leaned her head against his shoulder, contentment washing over her. "It already is." Michael, now crawling with determination and pulling himself up on furniture, seemed to sense the happiness around him. He had become increasingly attached to Blake, reaching for him whenever he entered the room and falling asleep contentedly in the big man's arms. "He'll call you Papa soon enough," Hannah said softly one night as Blake rocked Michael to sleep. Blake looked down at the drowsy baby with such tenderness it made Hannah's heart swell. "I'd like that," he whispered. "Very much." The week before the wedding, a letter arrived from Silverline addressed to Hannah. The handwriting was unfamiliar, and Hannah opened it with curiosity as she sat at the kitchen table. As she read, the color drained from her face. "Hannah." Blake asked from the doorway, immediately concerned by her expression. "What is it?" Wordlessly, Hannah handed him the letter. It was from a lawyer in Silverline, informing her that Thomas's family in Boston had finally been notified of his death and were claiming custody of Michael. They were sending a representative to collect the child and would arrive within the week. "They can't do this," Blake said, his voice tight with anger. "They can't just take your son." Hannah fought back tears. "The letter says they have a legal right. Thomas's father is a judge in Boston. They claim they can provide advantages for Michael that I can't." Blake knelt beside her chair, taking her trembling hands in his. "Listen to me, Hannah. No one is taking Michael from you, from us. I won't let that happen. But if they have the law on their side, then we'll fight them with everything we've got," Blake said firmly. "Michael belongs with his mother, with us." Hannah looked into Blake's resolute face and felt a surge of love and gratitude. This man who had come into her life so unexpectedly was now prepared to fight for her and her son as if they were already his family. "What should we do?" she asked. "First, we get married tomorrow, not next week," Blake decided. "I'll ride to Silverline tonight to fetch Reverend Clark. Being a married woman with a husband to provide for Michael will strengthen your position." Hannah nodded, seeing the wisdom in this plan. "And then we talk to Judge Patterson. He's a fair man and he knows me. He might be able to help us navigate the legal aspects." Blake squeezed her hands reassuringly. "We'll fight this together, Hannah. I promise you that." True to his word, Blake rode out that evening for Silverline, returning the next day with Reverend Clark, Judge Patterson, and the town lawyer, Mr. Simmons. Mrs. Carson and her sons arrived shortly after, alerted by a message Blake had sent with one of his ranch hands. The wedding took place that afternoon on the front porch of the ranch house. Hannah wore her new blue dress, with wildflowers in her hair and Michael in her arms. Blake stood tall and proud beside her, his eyes never leaving her face as they spoke their vows. "I promise to love and cherish you and Michael for all the days of my life," he added to the traditional words, "to protect you with everything I am." When Reverend Clark pronounced them husband and wife, Blake kissed Hannah with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. In that moment, despite the threat hanging over them, Hannah felt a profound sense of rightness. Whatever came, they would face it together. After a simple wedding supper, Judge Patterson and Mr. Simmons sat down with Blake and Hannah to discuss their situation. Michael played on a blanket nearby, oblivious to the serious conversation regarding his future. "The O'Briens are a powerful family in Boston, Mr. Simmons explained, reviewing the letter. "They could make a compelling case that they can provide advantages for the boy that you cannot. Material advantages, perhaps," Hannah countered. "But what about a mother's love? What about the stability of the home we've made here?" Judge Patterson nodded thoughtfully. "Those are important considerations, and the fact that you're now married to a man of Blake's standing in the community will help your case." Blake leaned forward. "What exactly do we need to do, Judge?" "First, we prepare a formal response to their claim, asserting your rights as the child's mother and now as a family unit with the means to provide for him." The judge looked at Hannah. Have you had any communication with your late husband's family before this? Hannah shook her head. Thomas was somewhat estranged from them. They disapproved of his desire to go west, thought he was throwing away his education and prospects. They didn't even attend our wedding. And did they offer any assistance after his death? None, Hannah said bitterly. I wrote to inform them, but received no reply until this legal claim. Judge Patterson made some notes. That will work in your favor. They showed no interest in the child's welfare until now. For the next hour, they worked on drafting a formal response to the O'Brien's claim. Mr. Simmons, who would represent them legally, advised them on the strongest arguments to make and the procedures to follow. The representative from Boston should arrive within the next few days, he said, as they concluded their meeting. I suggest you both be prepared for a difficult confrontation. People of means often believe they can simply have their way in such matters. Let them try, Blake said, his jaw set in determination. 3 days later, a carriage arrived at the ranch, bearing a well-dressed gentleman who introduced himself as Edwin Blackwell, attorney for the O'Brien family of Boston. He looked out of place in his tailored suit and polished shoes, clearly uncomfortable with the dust and rustic surroundings of the ranch. Blake and Hannah received him in the main room of the house, with Michael playing contentedly on the floor nearby. Mr. Simmons had arrived earlier to provide legal support, and Mrs. Carson had insisted on staying as a witness and moral support. Mrs. Vance, Mr. Blackwell began, addressing Hannah with her new name. I represent Judge O'Brien and his wife in the matter of their grandson, Michael. I have the necessary legal documents for the transfer of custody and arrangements for the child's journey to Boston. There will be no transfer of custody, Mr. Blackwell, Hannah replied firmly. Michael stays with me, his mother and my husband. Blackwell's expression hardened. I'm afraid you misunderstand, madam. This is not a negotiation. The O'Briens have legal standing as the child's grandparents, and they can provide advantages you simply cannot match here in this wilderness. Blake stepped forward, his presence imposing. My wife and I can provide everything Michael needs: a loving home, financial security, and the benefits of growing up in the fresh air with both parents who adore him. Parents, Blackwell raised an eyebrow. You, sir, are not the boy's father. I will be in every way that matters, Blake responded evenly. I've legally adopted him as part of our marriage agreement. This was not entirely accurate. The adoption papers had been drawn up but not yet processed, but Blake's confident assertion seemed to give Blackwell pause. Mr. Simmons produced the documents they had prepared. As you can see, Mr. Blackwell, the child's mother has made appropriate arrangements for his welfare. Furthermore, Judge O'Brien and his wife showed no interest in their grandson until now, despite being informed of their son's death months ago. Blackwell scanned the papers, his frown deepening. This changes nothing. The O'Briens are prepared to go to court if necessary. They have considerable resources and influence. So do we, Blake said quietly. Perhaps not the same kind of resources, but Judge Patterson in Silverline is an old friend. He takes a dim view of outsiders trying to separate a child from his loving mother. Mrs. Carson, who had been silently observing, spoke up. I've watched this young woman care for that baby through the hardest winter in years. She's a devoted mother, and Blake here loves that child like his own. You go back and tell those high and mighty folks in Boston that out here we stand by our own. They'll have to go through all of us to take that baby. Blackwell looked taken aback by the united front before him. His eyes drifted to Michael, who had crawled over to Blake and was pulling himself up on the man's legs, smiling up at him with complete trust. The journey would be difficult for one so young, Blackwell conceded, the first crack in his resolve. Hannah seized the opportunity. Mr. Blackwell, I understand that Thomas's parents want to know their grandson. I would never deny them that right. Perhaps we could reach a compromise. They could visit here, or when Michael is older, he could spend some time with them in Boston. Blackwell considered this, clearly recognizing that his position was weaker than he had anticipated. I was instructed to bring the child back with me. And if you return without him, Blake asked, they will likely pursue legal action. Mr. Simmons leaned forward. which would be costly, time-consuming, and ultimately might not succeed. The courts increasingly recognize the mother's right to her child, especially when she can provide a stable home. Blackwell sighed, appearing to reassess his approach. Perhaps I should communicate your proposed compromise to my clients before proceeding further. That seems wise, Blake agreed. In the meantime, you're welcome to stay in Silverline. The hotel there is quite comfortable. It was a dismissal, polite but firm, and Blackwell recognized it as such. He gathered his papers, cast one last look at Michael, who was now being picked up by Blake, and nodded stiffly. I will send a telegram to Boston today and await their response. Good day. After Blackwell had departed, Hannah's composure finally broke. She sank into a chair, tears of relief and lingering fear streaming down her face. Blake immediately came to her side, still holding Michael. It's all right, he soothed. You did wonderfully, we all did. Do you think it worked? Hannah asked, looking up at him and then at Mr. Simmons. The lawyer nodded cautiously. I believe Mr. Blackwell will advise his clients to accept your compromise. It's a reasonable solution, and pursuing legal action would be uncertain and costly, even for a family of means. Mrs. Carson patted Hannah's shoulder. That fancy lawyer could see with his own eyes what we all know, that baby belongs with his mama and Blake. Sometimes seeing is believing. Blake knelt beside Hannah's chair, still cradling Michael, who was contentedly playing with a button on his vest. No matter what happens, Hannah, we'll face it together. No one is going to take our son from us. Our son. The words warmed Hannah's heart, reinforcing what she already knew, that Blake Vance was the father Michael needed, the husband she hadn't dared hope for after losing Thomas. 3 days later, another letter arrived from Silverline. With trembling hands, Hannah opened it, Blake standing close beside her. They've agreed to the compromise, she announced, relief evident in her voice as she read the letter. They still want Michael to visit Boston when he's older, but they're no longer seeking custody. Blake wrapped his arms around her, pulling her and Michael into a tight embrace. It's over, we won. Hannah buried her face against his chest, overwhelmed with gratitude and joy. Thank you, she whispered, for fighting for us, for loving us. Blake kissed the top of her head, then bent to kiss Michael's cheek. That's what family does, and that's what we are now, a family. That evening, after Michael had been put to bed in what would soon become a proper nursery, Blake was already planning the furniture he would build. Husband and wife stood on the porch, looking out at the stars emerging in the twilight sky. 6 months ago, I thought my life was over, Hannah said softly. Standing in that street in Silverline, being mocked for crying over my baby, with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. Blake drew her close against his side. And I was just passing through town, never expecting my life to change in an instant. When you told those people I was your family. Hannah smiled at the memory. Did you have any idea how true those words would become? Blake chuckled, turning to face her fully. I think some part of me knew, even then, that you and Michael were meant to be mine, that we were meant to be a family. Hannah reached up to trace the line of his jaw with her fingers. I love you, Blake Vance. And I love you, Hannah Vance, he replied, lowering his lips to hers in a kiss that promised a lifetime of tomorrows. As they stood together under the vast Wyoming sky, Hannah thought of the journey that had brought her here, the grief, the fear, the uncertainty. And now, the joy of finding love again, of building a family with this strong, kind man who had defended her when she was at her most vulnerable. They had weathered their first storm together and emerged stronger. There would be other challenges ahead, Hannah knew, but facing them with Blake by her side made all the difference in the world. Inside the house, Michael slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge, even if only sensed in his infant heart, that he was loved and protected. He would grow up with a mother who had survived heartbreak to find happiness again, and a father who had chosen him as surely as if he had been his own flesh and blood. And that, Hannah reflected as she leaned into her husband's embrace, was the greatest gift of all the family they had created together, born not of obligation but of love, choice, and the courage to begin again. 5 years later, the morning sun streamed through the curtains of the enlarged ranch house, casting golden light across the kitchen where Hannah Vance stood kneading bread dough. Outside, the sounds of children's laughter mingled with the familiar noises of ranch life, horses nickering, cattle lowing in the distance, men calling to each other as they went about their work. "Mama, Mama, look what Papa taught me." 5-year-old Michael burst through the door, his dark hair tousled by the wind and his blue eyes so like his birth father's alight with excitement. Hannah smiled, wiping flour from her hands. "What is it, sweetheart?" "I can throw a lasso, a real one." Michael demonstrated with an imaginary rope, his small face scrunched in concentration. "That's wonderful," Hannah praised, bending to kiss his forehead. "Where's your sister?" With Papa, he's showing her the new calf. Michael climbed onto a chair to reach for a cookie from the jar on the counter. "Can I have one, please? Just one. Dinner will be ready soon." Hannah ruffled his hair affectionately. At 3, Sarah Vance was as fearless and curious as her older brother, though she had her father's dark hair and steady gaze. Named for Blake's first love, with Hannah's blessing, she had been born almost exactly 9 months after their wedding, a honeymoon baby as Mrs. Carson had declared with a knowing smile. Hannah pressed the bread dough into pans and covered it to rise, her movements practiced and efficient after years of keeping house for her growing family. As she worked, she glanced occasionally at the framed photographs on the wall. Her wedding day with Blake and Michael. The day Blake's adoption of Michael had become official, Sarah's birth. And the most recent addition, a family portrait taken during their visit to Boston last summer. The O'Briens, true to their word, had not pursued custody of Michael. Instead, after a few years of exchanging letters and photographs, they had invited the entire Vance family to visit them in Boston. The trip had been eye-opening for all of them. Michael had been fascinated by the city. Blake had been surprisingly at ease in Thomas's childhood home, and Hannah had found a measure of peace in seeing her late husband's parents embrace both of her children with equal affection. Judge O'Brien, a stern but ultimately fair-minded man, had even offered to fund Michael's education when the time came, an offer Blake and Hannah had accepted with grace, recognizing it as the olive branch it was meant to be. The ranch had prospered in the 5 years since Blake and Hannah's marriage. With the profits from his cattle drives, Blake had been able to purchase additional land, improve the breeding stock, and hire more hands. The original house had been expanded to include proper bedrooms for the children, a larger kitchen, and even a small library filled with books for the entire family. Hannah had found her place not just as Blake's wife and the children's mother, but as a respected member of the community. She had started a small school in a room added to the ranch house, teaching not only Michael and Sarah, but also the children of neighboring ranchers and the ranch hands' families. The knowledge she had gained as a teacher in Boston was now serving a new generation in Wyoming Territory. The sound of boots on the porch alerted Hannah to Blake's return. He entered with Sarah perched on his shoulders, her small hands gripping his hair. "Mama, I saw the baby cow," Sarah announced excitedly. "It's brown with a white spot." Blake lifted his daughter down, wincing slightly as she accidentally pulled his hair in the process. "Careful there, little lady. Papa needs what hair he's got left." At 35, Blake Vance was in his prime, still strong and vital, though with a few strands of gray at his temples that Hannah found rather distinguished. The years of hard work had added lines to his face, but happiness had softened them around his eyes and mouth. He crossed the room to kiss Hannah, his arm slipping naturally around her waist. "Something smells good." "Beef stew," she replied, leaning into his embrace for a moment, "and fresh bread once it rises. MMM." Blake breathed in deeply, appreciation evident in his expression. "Best cooking in the territory." "Papa, can we ride to the north pasture after dinner?" Michael asked, tugging at Blake's hand. "You promised to show me the eagle's nest, if it's all right with your mother," Blake replied, glancing at Hannah. "As long as you're home before dark," she agreed. "And you mind everything your papa tells you, Michael, no wandering off." "Yes, madam," Michael promised solemnly. Sarah tugged at her father's pants leg. "Me too, I go too," Blake chuckled, lifting her into his arms. "Not today, princess. The north pasture is too far for little legs. But how about you help Mama with the bread while Michael and I are gone? Then tomorrow we can all ride to the creek for a picnic." Sarah considered this bargain, her small brow furrowed in concentration. I want to need, she decided. Then need you shall, Hannah agreed, smiling at her daughter's determination. As the family sat down to dinner, Hannah looked around the table at the faces she loved most in the world: Blake, strong and steady; Michael, growing so fast and so curious about everything; Sarah, with her father's stubborn chin and her mother's gentle heart. From the ashes of tragedy, they had built this life together. The grief that had once threatened to overwhelm Hannah had not disappeared entirely. There were still moments when she thought of Thomas, wondering what he would think of the man his son was becoming, but it had transformed into something softer, a bittersweet memory that no longer had the power to cause pain. What are you thinking about, love? Blake asked quietly, noticing her thoughtful expression. Hannah smiled at him, her heart full. Just how fortunate we are, how far we've come. Blake nodded, understanding in his eyes. He reached across the table to take her hand, his thumb caressing her wedding ring. From that day in Silverline to this, he said softly, I thank God every day for bringing you and Michael into my life. And me, Sarah piped up, not wanting to be left out. Blake laughed, releasing Hannah's hand to tousle his daughter's dark curls. Yes, and you, my little wildflower. And the new baby, Michael added matter-of-factly, causing both Blake and Hannah to freeze. New baby, Blake repeated, looking at Hannah with wide eyes. Is there something you want to tell me, Mrs. Vance? Hannah's hand went instinctively to her stomach, where she had only recently begun to suspect a new life was growing. She had planned to tell Blake privately that evening, after the children were in bed. Michael, what makes you think there's a new baby? She asked carefully. Michael shrugged, spooning another bite of stew. I heard Mrs. Carson telling Hank's wife that you had the same glow you did before Sarah came, and that your dresses were getting tight. He looked up innocently. Isn't that how babies happen? Ladies get a glow and bigger dresses. Blake burst out laughing while Hannah felt her cheeks flush. Well, she said, meeting her husband's gaze with a smile, Mrs. Carson has always been observant. Blake's expression softened into wonder. Is it true? Are we having another baby? Hannah nodded, joy bubbling up inside her. I was going to tell you tonight. It's early yet, the baby shouldn't arrive until winter. In 2 strides, Blake was around the table, pulling Hannah to her feet and into his arms. Another child, he whispered against her hair. Another blessing. Michael and Sarah watched with interest as their parents embraced, accustomed to such displays of affection but curious about the excitement over the news. Will it be a brother or a sister? Michael asked pragmatically. We won't know until the baby arrives, Hannah explained, turning within the circle of Blake's arms to look at her children. But either way, you'll both be wonderful with the new baby, just as you are with each other. I want a sister, Sarah declared firmly. Brothers are too noisy. Hey. Michael protested, but with a grin that showed he wasn't really offended. As the children debated the merits of brothers versus sisters, Blake held Hannah close, his hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach. Happy? He asked softly. Completely, she replied, tilting her face up for his kiss. I never imagined that day in Silverline when you claimed us as your family that it would lead to this, to such happiness. I meant those words even then, Blake admitted. That's my family she holds. Somehow I knew it was true, or would be. You and Michael were meant to be mine, just as Sarah and this new little one are. Hannah leaned into his strength, grateful beyond words for the man who had defended her when she was at her most vulnerable, who had given her a home when she had none, who had chosen to love a child not his own, and had built a life with her that exceeded her wildest dreams. We are yours, she whispered. Always. As the sun began to set over the Wyoming Valley, painting the sky in hues of gold and rose, the Vance family finished their meal together. Soon Blake and Michael would ride out to see the eagle's nest. Sarah would help Hannah with the dishes and then practice her letters. And the day would close as it had begun, with love, with purpose, with the deep contentment of knowing they were exactly where they were meant to be. For Hannah, who had once stood weeping in a dusty street with nowhere to turn, this life was nothing short of miraculous. She had been mocked for crying over her baby, but a kind cowboy had stood up for her, claiming them as his family. And in that moment of compassion, the seeds of their future together had been planted. Now, surrounded by the family they had built together, Hannah knew with absolute certainty that some endings were really beginnings in disguise. And some chance encounters were actually destiny, calling two hearts home to each other.